A black elderly man drives a vintage Lincoln quietly through a small southern town in the early morning. No speeding, no laws broken. Just one thing catches people's attention. He looks out of place. Welcome to a story whose ending you won't want to believe is true. But before we begin, we want to know one thing. Where are you watching from? What time is it right now? Leave a comment below and take a guess. What do you think will happen to that man in the town of Monroe where the slogan, "Justice walks with faith," still hangs on the welcome sign? Though no one reads it anymore, strange things never need an announcement. Officer Rick Delroy cruised down a quiet street in his patrol car. One hand tapped the steering wheel. Radio off, eyes idly scanning the thin traffic. Nothing was happening, and it was exactly that. Nothing that made him suspicious. Then he saw him. An old Lincoln tinted windows driving slow, steady. No infractions. The driver, an elderly black man, maybe pushing 70, wearing a felt hat, a suit, black gloves, calm. Didn't check the rearview mirror. Didn't glance sideways. Too polite, too quiet, too unlike someone hiding something. In Rick's mind, something lit up not from a surveillance system but from instinct. The kind of instinct some call professional experience. Though others know it by a different name, legally wrapped prejudice, Rick flipped on the red and blue lights. The car pulled over smoothly like it had done this 100 times before. No arguing, no denial, no begging. Just a silence that made you feel like you were the one being scrutinized. Bathroom. That's when a routine stop began to take a different turn. And if you're thinking, surely the old man will just hand over his papers, apologize, and be on his way, you're about to find out he's not just any ordinary citizen. He's a man who once signed into law the very regulations. The officer stopping him doesn't even realize he's violating her own. This isn't just a traffic stop. It's a test of conscience for an entire system. And the question is, who really deserves to be questioned here? Don't look away. Don't mute the sound, because what comes next might make you rethink everything that you thought you knew about Justice, Monroe, Georgia. A March morning, not too cold, not too loud, nothing special, except Officer Rick Delroy, 38 years old traffic cop leader in suspicious activity detection for his department, was feeling a little unsettled. Not because of the weather, not traffic, but because of a matte black Lincoln ahead of him, cruising quietly, almost like it was trying not to cause a scene. Rick sat in his patrol car, fingers tapping the steering wheel to music that wasn't playing. The radio was off. No calls, no flag plates, nothing at all. And it was exactly that, nothing that made Rick uneasy. The car looked too proper, no dents, no dirt, no diesel smell, no tacky bumper stickers, only a slightly chipped license plate, but still legal. And the driver, a black elder wearing a felt hat, suit, crisp black gloves. Upright posture, steady hands, never once checked the rearview mirror. Not nervous, not sneaky, not even trying to be friendly. Rick squinted. His cop instincts, or what he liked to call his justice sensor, began to tingle. Nice car. Not new, but not cheap. Driver doesn't fit the car, Rick muttered to himself. Smells suspicious. Like the kind of suspicious that doesn't smell like anything at all. That's the real giveaway. He flipped the lights on. The Lincoln pulled over immediately. The Lincoln pulled over smoothly, as if the man behind the wheel had rehearsed this moment his entire life. No panic, no hesitation, nothing that gave Rick any real reason to escalate. And it was precisely that calm, unshakable deliberate that made Rick feel like he needed to do something to assert authority. Rick stepped out of the cruiser, hand resting lightly on his holster, not from fear, but habit. When the window slid down, the old man turned to face him. Eyes dark, deep, and steady, not distant, but not deferential either. There was nothing in his gaze that screamed defiance. But there was nothing submissive about it either. Just a look that made you feel unexpectedly like you were the one being inspected. Rick swallowed, his breath remained steady, but something inside began to stir. Good morning. He started, keeping his tone neutral. Do you know why I pulled you over? The man tilted his head slightly as if to listen more carefully. I don't guess I let you decide. His voice was deep, warm, not sarcastic, not yielding. Rick hesitated. The response wasn't confrontational, but it didn't open the usual script either. It was a reply without recoil, not pushing back, not slipping away. Where are you headed? Rick redirected. I'm going to say goodbye to someone I knew who, Rick asked, not from care, but to drag him into a conversation he could control. A part of history, the man said, eyes still fixed straight ahead. Tuyishim. Rick furrowed his brow. There were no instructions in the manual for answers like this. Too vague to act on, too exact to dismiss. He walked back to his cruiser, ran the plates. Clean valid. Nothing, he returned, tapping the window frame lightly. Let me see your documents. The man handed over a small black wallet, worn at the corners but clean. Inside was a government ID, not standard issue, with a faint silver seal. Rick held it up to the light. I've never seen this before, he said, half joking, half suspicious. If in doubt, feel free to verify, the man replied, unfazed. Rick wasn't used to this kind of interaction. No argument, no trembling, no pleading. Just presence, and that presence made him feel like he was the one who needed to justify himself. At that moment, something strange began to form inside Rick. Not doubt, not anger, but a question he had never been trained to confront. What if I'm wrong, Chaim? This stop was no longer a routine check. It had become an examination of awareness, and Rick, a man who always believed he was right, because he followed procedure, was now face to face with the one thing procedure couldn't teach. How do you recognize dignity when it doesn't raise its voice? The red and blue lights flickered in the Lincoln side mirror. Franklin O. Gaines didn't sigh, didn't flinch, didn't rush. He simply pulled over. Every motion, textbook, perfect. No jerks, no drifting, no correction. The car settled into place like it knew exactly where it belonged, and Rick Delroy felt irritated by that fact. Calm is suspicious. In Monroe, a small town where black folks usually drive old cars, avoid confrontation, and never dare to look too put together, an elderly black man perfectly dressed in a pressed suit, a felt hat, driving a spotless car with an unflinching gaze, was an unsettling sight. Rick stepped out of his vehicle, eyes sweeping like a landmine detector in an empty room. His hand rested lightly on the holster, not out of need but habit. The habit called defensive readiness, though, and in reality it was just to calm his own sense of losing control when facing something unfamiliar. Franklin rolled the window down. Morning light fell across his face. His eyes weren't challenging, nor were they deferential. They simply waited as if to see what move Rick would try next. Good morning? Rick began, not exactly friendly, but not hostile either. Do you know why I pulled you over? Franklin tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing as if he'd just heard a question too lazy to consider. I assume you have your reasons, and I shouldn't be the one guessing. The answer wasn't wrong, it was polite, appropriate, but it didn't sit right because it didn't let Rick take control. Rick bristled. This man didn't smile, didn't apologize, didn't fumble. And that was exactly what Rick wasn't used to. He glanced into the car. Nothing inside but a neatly wrapped box of flowers, a hat on the passenger seat, and a small leather bag. Franklin stayed composed, hands on the wheel, like he knew exactly what Rick was trying to assess. Where are you headed? Rick asked again, his tone tighter now, probing for emotion. I'm on my way to a farewell. Who passed? Rick pushed, not because he cared. A part of history, the man answered, still not turning to face him. Rick frowned. That answer, too clever. Too disarming out there. He returned to his cruiser, ran the plates. No violations, no warrants, license valid. Even the car wasn't flagged. Insurance active, registration. Current, nothing. No excuse to escalate. But Rick, a man who lived by professional instinct, didn't need reasons. Just a gut feeling. Sure. He came back, trying to keep calm. Let me see your documents. Franklin didn't object, didn't act eager. He pulled out a worn black wallet, unfancy but clean, and calmly handed over a card. Rick took it, a government-issued ID with a faint silver seal rarely seen outside Washington. This looks unusual. Rick smirked. If you think it's fake, you are welcome to call it in, Franklin said, as casually as if giving directions to a cafe. Japan. It was that very calm that made Rick squirm. The man didn't deny, didn't explain, didn't apologize. He handed all authority back to Rick while giving him no legitimate cause to act. Rick hissed through his teeth. The man should have been afraid. He should have stammered some apology like others always did. Charm. Instead, Franklin looked at him like measuring the depth of a puddle he'd walked through 1,000 times before. I suspect something irregular. I'd like to check the trunk, Rick said, forcing his voice steady. Then write that suspicion down, the man replied calmly. Rick paused. I haven't filed a report. Then you're searching me based on a feeling, Franklin said slowly. No mockery, no disdain, just stating out loud what Rick didn't want to admit. Rick felt like he was being tried in a strange courtroom where the silent man was the one issuing judgment. He inhaled, clenched his jaw. No resistance, but also no willing compliance. And that to Rick was worse than defiance because it exposed the truth. He wasn't wielding the law. He was wielding empty authority. Char. Franklin remained still like a statue, but his unwavering gaze forced Rick to turn away. He needed a reason, anything to write in his report. One line, one technicality, anything, to legalize his own discomfort. And in that moment, Rick made a decision request to open the trunk. He held the ID card in his hand. It wasn't glossy, no modern federal chip embedded, just a matte black piece of plastic and edges slightly worn, bearing a faint silver seal etched with the name Franklin O. Gaines. In one corner, a line of text so fine it was almost unreadable. Supreme Court of the State of Georgia, Article 4, Judiciary Authorization. Rick frowned. Not because the content was confusing, but because what lay in his hand felt too legal. Legal to the point of discomfort, as if it wasn't meant for ordinary people to even touch. He tilted the card under the light. The silver glinted like sharpened steel. It looked nothing like a typical ID. He glanced at Franklin, still sitting calmly, hands on the wheel like a man who had never once needed to prove himself. Rick tried to keep his voice steady. I've never seen this type of ID. Looks kind of fake, if so. Franklin replied, voice soft as a tea invitation. Call the station. I've got nothing to hide. Cheer. That sentence quiet yet ringing. No defense, no resistance, just a clear path for the truth. And that very clarity made Rick feel like he wasn't investigating a man, but interrogating his own conscience. He walked back to the patrol car, his footsteps heavier than before. Gone was the firm tread of an officer in control. Left were uncertain, staggered steps, the gait of someone trying to balance between reasonable suspicion and disguised arrogance. Rick switched on the radio, his voice dry. Dispatch, this is Delroy. I need to verify an ID name as Franklin. O. Gaines. There was a pause, not static, not poor reception, just 3 seconds of silence. 3 seconds harmless on paper, but long enough to make Rick's pulse falter. A female voice replied, no longer the routine dispatcher. You said Franklin O.L. Gaines. The voice was neither high nor low, but it carried weight. Rick nodded instinctively, even though no one could see. Yes, I've stopped him. Suspected a forged ID. Boy, another silence, this time 5 seconds. The new voice came back, composed but deliberate. Hold position, stay calm. Do not take any further action with the subject. We are routing to secondary verification. Rick froze. Secondary. That phrase wasn't used for civilians. It was reserved for IDs linked to high-level government entities or people in protected tiers. Rick felt his throat drying. Not from heat, but from a rare feeling, not being the one in control. He sat back in the seat. Franklin remained in his car, upright eyes forward, as if waiting not for a person's decision, but for the system's judgment. The phone buzzed in the cruiser. Not the radio, not a secure channel. A personal call from his superior, Lieutenant Hank Ellis. Rick hesitated, then picked up Delroy. I just got an emergency alert. Are you holding Franklin Gaines right now? I just pulled him over to check his papers. The ID looks suspicious. Ellis's tone dropped. Listen closely. He's not a suspect. He's not someone to be processed. He is a living symbol of this system. One of the architects behind our state's civil rights policy. You're detaining a Supreme Court justice, a man who could rewrite the very law you think you're enforcing. Rick looked through the windshield. Franklin still hadn't turned his head. No anger, no pressure, no impatience. And that only made Rick feel more suffocated. Thornton Ellis's voice turned cold as steel. Are you still holding his ID? Yes, then give it back. And if he doesn't say anything, you say nothing. Do not ask him for anything else, Rick swallowed hard. Sitting before him was a man whose power didn't come from a uniform, but from a silence strong enough to make an entire system speak up. Rick stepped out of the car. The morning wind felt like it was blowing against him cold and straight down his spine. He held the ID card in his hand, returning it, his hand slightly trembling. Though he tried to appear calm, Franklin didn't smile, didn't rebuke. He simply took the card between two fingers, placed it back into his wallet quietly, like closing a book written in a language Rick didn't know how to read. The voice from dispatch came through, and even over the radio, the hesitation was unmistakable. "You just said Franklin O'Gaines." Rick fell silent. Inside the cruiser, the system display seemed to slow down, not just for the name, but as if the entire system had frozen. A different voice picked up. No longer the usual operator, but a lower, colder female voice. "Cease all actions on site. Hold position. That name requires high-tier verification." Rick felt a cold sweat bead along his hairline. Who was this man that the mere mention of his name shifted dispatch's tone and triggered a different clearance level? As if to underscore Rick's unraveling thoughts, Franklin sat still in the car. That upright posture, hands on the wheel facing Rick, like he was the one being interrogated. Rick clenched his teeth. He felt the tide turning against him. He needed to take back control. "Step out of the vehicle. Open the trunk." His voice was firm, sharp. Franklin didn't move immediately. He turned, looking Rick straight in the eye. "What do you suspect I'm carrying in there?" Rick stammered. "I have my doubts. The car isn't clear." "Your behavior is uncooperative." Franklin shook his head, eyes steady. "You're suspicious because I'm silent, because I'm calm." Rick swallowed hard. He'd always thought silence was a sign of guilt. But now, facing this man, silence had become a weapon. Franklin unbuckled his seatbelt, slowly opened the door. He stood tall, not a large man, but the way he looked at Rick made the space between them shrink. "I'll open the trunk," he said. "But if you find nothing, what will you do next?" Rick couldn't answer. He was facing a dilemma no academy had prepared him for. How do you retreat with dignity when you were never supposed to attack? Franklin walked to the back of the car, reached into his coat pocket, and unlocked the trunk slowly, deliberately. A bouquet of white flowers wrapped in brown craft paper, a folded old fedora with a frayed silver band, a small wooden box engraved E.L. Gaines. No weapons. No contraband, nothing illegal, just memories, just a name, just a journey to a place no one ever wants to mention: a cemetery. Rick didn't know what to say. Franklin looked at him, voice calm. "I only carry what needs. No explanation." "Are you looking for something else?" Rick shook his head. There were no reasons left, only regret. Franklin gently closed the trunk. The sound was soft, like sealing a verdict, as he returned to the car. Rick said nothing. He just stood there watching the white bouquet and the small wooden box. So he'd remember. Sometimes what chills a system isn't a bomb or a knife, but a name everyone thought they'd forgotten. Franklin stood beside the car. Entirely unbothered, he looked into the trunk, his gaze softening as if caught in a quiet memory. Then he turned to Rick and spoke in an even tone. "I'm not hiding anything. I'm just carrying a memory." Rick meant to ask something, but the words wouldn't come. The white bouquet, the old hat, the box bearing a name, all of it resembled a silent funeral rite, a journey that needed no explanation. "This is for my wife," Franklin continued. "She passed away 2 years ago. Tomorrow is her birthday. I brought flowers and the hat she gave me the first year we were married. The wooden box holds her ashes. I plan to bury it next to her mother as she wished." Rick felt the back of his neck go cold. He didn't know how to respond. This moment felt like a morality lesson disguised as a routine stop. But there was nothing routine about it. Franklin didn't show emotion. No tears, no trembling voice. He spoke simply like a man who'd grown familiar with grief to the point it had become part of him. His voice didn't waver. His eyes didn't redden. But Rick felt himself trembling. "If you need another reason to search," Franklin added, still looking at the bouquet, "I'll open the box, but I hope you don't. I believe in checks. I believe in procedure. But I also believe silence isn't always something to fear." Rick gave no reply. He couldn't. Everything he'd ever trusted tells behavior. Gut instinct was being tested by something not found in any manual dignity. Franklin gently closed the trunk. No harsh motion, no loud sound, just a soft click like the final sentence in a chapter. He turned and faced Rick. No resentment in his eyes, no defiance. Just a look, deep, quiet, and enough to make the man across from him feel exposed. I'll return to my car now. If you need anything else, just call me. Otherwise, I believe this stop has gone on long enough. Rick stood frozen, watching the old man walk back to the driver's seat, adjust his rear-view mirror, and fasten his seatbelt as if nothing had happened. But Rick knew something had happened to him. And perhaps for the first time in his career, not to someone else. He didn't know whether to proceed or step back, but the name Franklin O. Gaines was no longer just a data entry. It was an open question, a quiet background note echoing in his mind. What was I thinking when I flipped those lights on? In the distance, sunlight started to filter through the trees. The white bouquet in the trunk still haunted Rick's eyes, a pure white in a moment tangled with doubt. He turned back toward his cruiser, fingers brushing the radio, ready to make the final call of the day, but perhaps the call that would reshape his entire career. While Rick lingered by his cruiser not far off, a middle-aged woman pulled out her phone and whispered to the person beside her, "Record this. That man hasn't done anything wrong." The phone camera came on. The frame trembled slightly as it zoomed in on an old black man in a faded fedora, stepping out of his car, opening the trunk and quietly revealing a bouquet of white flowers, a wooden box and an unspeakable heaviness. No yelling, no force, no signs of resistance. Just one thing that made the person filming hold their breath. His composure, the video barely 40 seconds long, was posted on social media with the caption, "He said nothing, but the whole town is rethinking itself." At first, just a few dozen views, mostly from local friends, but within an hour it spread thousands, then tens of thousands. Not because there was some shocking twist. No one was assaulted, no one screamed. Simply this, a man did not fight back and yet made an entire system lower its head. The top comment read, "I don't know who he is, but that look made me ashamed. I ever thought silence meant nothing to say." A verified local journalist quoted the clip adding, "When someone is that calm in the face of power, either they've endured too much or power needs to reevaluate itself." That afternoon in the Monroe Police Department, an emergency meeting was held off the record. While many officers busied themselves with talk of clarifying the incident and protecting the department's image, a rookie on the shift quietly spoke up. "I just wonder, if he wasn't a judge, if he was, nobody would this video still be seen the same way." The question dropped like a pin in the room. 3 seconds of silence, longer than any report they'd ever signed. Outside, the video kept spreading. No one needed confirmation of who the old man was, because what mattered wasn't who he was, but that he'd done nothing wrong and was still treated with suspicion simply for being too calm, too composed, too different from what some believed a person should look like when afraid of the police. A high school teacher used the clip to open a civics and ethics class and asked the students, "If you were the officer in this video, what would you ask next?" A student stood up. "I wouldn't ask. I'd apologize." Within just 12 hours of the video being posted, everyone in the town of Millridge, and soon all across Georgia, knew the name Franklin O. Gaines. The surprising part, it wasn't the press that blew the story wide open. It was the community. Comments, shares, and reactions flooded in like a summer downpour. "I don't know who he is, but I know he didn't deserve to be pulled over just for driving while black. If this is what cautious policing looks like, I'd rather live recklessly." And then a real twist, a verified social media account belonging to a Gulf War veteran posted a brief tweet. "Franklin O. Gaines signed my clemency order in 1991 after I was wrongfully convicted in the military. Without him, I'd have died in prison. And now he's being pulled over." For being black, within 3 minutes, the tweet had over 15,000 likes and nearly 7,000 shares. What began as a silent video became a social reckoning. A cafe in the town center put up a small sign. "From today, we'll ask your name and see you as a person, not a profile." A local high school, previously silent on political matters, dedicated an entire civics period to the clip. The young teacher stood before the class, pressed play, and didn't say a word. The class sat in silence for 3 full minutes after the video ended. Then a young girl stood, voice trembling. "If the law doesn't discriminate, why do police eyes change when they look at our skin?" At that same moment across town in a law school in Atlanta, the message board outside the main lecture hall had been replaced by students with a single hashtag, "Silence is judgment." The movement spread not with fury, but like a silent wave rolling with unstoppable force. There were no protests, not yet. No cars burned, no windows shattered. But thousands of essays, think pieces, podcasts, and reaction videos poured in like a breach in the dam. Then came a second video. It had been captured by a nearby traffic camera, showing Rick standing in front of the open trunk, frozen, saying nothing, like he was the one being questioned. No one knew who uploaded it, but the title shook the internet. The cop made the stop, but it was his soul that got searched by the stare of a man who never said a word. And beneath that video, one pinned comment stood out. This isn't just about Franklin. This is about the millions who've stayed silent because they knew speaking wouldn't change a thing. A local news station tried to downplay the situation by interviewing a police spokesperson, but even the spokesperson stumbled over a single question from the reporter. If Mr. Gaines hadn't been a judge, just a gardener, would your officers have apologized? There was no answer. And that silence spoke louder than any statement. That night, the hashtag #silence. His judgment rose to the top. 3 trending topics on Twitter across the eastern United States. No one chanted slogans. No one shouted into megaphones. People simply posted a single image, a bouquet of white flowers in a car trunk next to the name E.L. Gaines. Social media didn't forgive. Not because people hated the police, but because this time they saw someone who said nothing. And it was that very calm that exposed a system driven by fear-based judgment. Rick Delroy used to believe in everything he was trained to do, that if he followed protocol, adhered to procedure, documented everything. He was a good cop, but the video of the traffic stop involving Franklin Gaines tore that illusion apart, like thin paper caught in a storm. Since the video went viral, Rick was no longer Rick. He wasn't suspended, he wasn't fired. But the way people looked at him, that was punishment enough. At the precinct, the colleagues who once high-fived him called him the Instinct. Scanner now fell silent when he entered. The polite nods disappeared. The morning cup of coffee a coworker used to make for him now sat cold and untouched on the table. No one said a word, and that silence said everything. What hurt more was home. Rick's 11-year-old son, Mason, used to see his dad as a role model. Once in class, when asked what he wanted to be when he grew up, Mason proudly said, "I want to be a cop, like my dad." But the night after the clip aired on the evening news, no background music, no commentary, just the image of Franklin standing beside his car with his hands raised and Rick opposite him, hand near his belt. Mason didn't leave the dinner table. He stared at his plate of cold fried eggs and whispered just loud enough for Rick to hear, though no one else at the table said a word. If you're a good person, why did he have to raise his hands like that? The question stabbed into Rick like a short razor-sharp blade, leaving him frozen. Not because it was wrong, but because he didn't have an answer either. Rick tried to explain that he was just following procedure, that he didn't know who the man was, that it was just a standard safety check. But every word he said sounded more like he was testifying in court than talking to his son. Mason didn't respond. He simply got up, left his breakfast, and went upstairs. The door closed softly, not in anger, but in something that shattered Rick even more. That was not the sound of rebellion. It was the sound of disappointment. A few days later, Rick received an email from Mason's school. The homeroom teacher said Mason had requested to miss a day. The reason written in the form was, "Don't want to be asked about my dad." That short sentence made Rick realize he was no longer the kind of father a son could speak about with pride. Rick didn't turn on the TV for days, but that didn't stop the wave of public opinion. Passing by a bakery, he saw a small screen behind the counter, replaying the news. The man pulled over without breaking the law in silence that changed America. Below that was an image of himself in uniform, face tight with tension and loss of control. One moment cut from thousands of similar situations where he thought he had done the right thing. But that one moment had become the new definition of his entire career. Rick started having a recurring dream. Franklin turning to look at him, saying nothing, just looking. And in that dream, Rick was the one feeling like he was being judged. One night, unable to sleep, Rick went down to his study. He pulled an old drawer open and dug through previous traffic stop reports. He noticed something of the last 20 stops. 16 were people of color. No one had ever filed a complaint. No one had ever resisted. But now Rick saw each number like a crack forming in concrete. And in his mind, the image of Franklin standing beside the white bouquet, the hat, and the urn wouldn't go away. Those quiet objects spoke more than anything. Rick had ever written in a report. He didn't know what to do. To justify himself felt meaningless. To stay silent felt cowardly. To quit felt weak. But to stay felt like a slow punishment, not from the law, but from his own conscience. And what hurt Rick the most wasn't being criticized online or shunned by colleagues. It was the fact that his son, the boy who once called him a hero, was now learning how to avoid his father's eyes, as if Rick had become something to be afraid of. Rick sat down in a chair, buried his face in his hands, and for the first time in his life, wished he hadn't turned on the red light that day. Franklin O. Gaines never gave an interview, never appeared on television, never made a speech, never held a press conference. He didn't demand an apology. He didn't sue Officer Rick Delroy. The press called it a strange silence. But those who had sat across from him in courtrooms in the Office of Justice or simply on a park bench knew the truth. It wasn't silence from powerlessness. It was the silence of a man who understood exactly how the system worked. He didn't need to speak because everyone else had started speaking for him. Within 2 weeks of the video going viral, over 60 law schools across the U.S. opened special seminars titled, "When One Person's Silence Makes the Entire System Feel Guilty, Is That Justice or Tragedy?" A former attorney who once worked under him wrote on Twitter, "I was taught to argue against every charge. He taught me when to stay silent so the other side could hear their own conscience." National media outlets began referring to him by many names. The man who didn't need to stand up to make the whole system reflect. The alarm bell that made no sound. The silent judge who made society realize it speaks too much and understands too little. At a state Senate hearing, a young senator said, "I've never met him, but that event made me revisit every vote I've ever cast and ask myself, did I really understand who would be affected by the laws I passed?" In professional ethics classes, law students now learn not only how to win a case, but also how not to let someone end up like Mr. Gaines. One final exam posed a single question. How would you act if someone said nothing but their look made you reconsider everything about the work you do? Rick Delroy, the officer who pulled him over, that day still works in the records division. Every morning as he walks past the internal bulletin board, he sees a piece of paper pinned at the center, unsigned. A wrong decision isn't always the end, but the silence that follows it can be the real sentence. No one dares take it down. Chatham. In one of Gaines's rare public appearances, not on a stage but in the back row of a judicial reform conference, he sat silently. No notepad, no questions. Yet the moment he looked up toward the panel table, the entire room subtly straightened its posture. No one mentioned him, no one introduced him, but every speech that followed was quieter, more careful, as if no one wanted to disappoint the man seated silently behind them. After the session, an intern whispered, "I've never seen someone silence an entire room just by sitting still." News outlets didn't call it an incident. They called it a moment where society looked in the mirror. Headlines didn't scream, "Police misconduct." They read, "When the system faces a man who helped build it and has nothing to say." Franklin. Gaines continues to visit the small office of justice in southern Atlanta once a week. As if nothing had changed, he reviews clemency, petitions, replies to letters from inmates no one else bothers with. A young staffer once said that he wrote only 3 words in response to a prisoner: "You still matter." Some have called him a hero who doesn't need a spotlight, but to him all of that is unnecessary. He never saw himself as a victim, let alone a symbol. He believes in one thing only. Justice doesn't need to shout to exist. Sometimes it just needs to stand still and let the rest of society hear its own conscience. That year's annual conference of the American Bar Association was held in Chicago in a hall that seated over 500 people, where legal experts, judges, politicians, and law students gathered from across the country, bringing with them thick presentations, detailed charts, and strong opinions on reform. No one expected that on that day, no presentation would be needed at all. As the program moved into its final segment, an elderly man walked into the auditorium. No bodyguards, no name badge, no earpiece, mic, just a neat brown overcoat, a worn silver fedora, and an old leather notebook tucked into his chest pocket. The first to recognize him was a third-year law student. She whispered, eyes fixed on the door. "It's him." A murmur rippled through the room like small waves, not loud but impossible to suppress. The host, a seasoned professor, froze mid-sentence, hand raised to switch to the next slide. He looked at the man slowly making his way to the back row. Franklin O. Gaines said nothing. He didn't need to. No one invited him to speak. No one dared. Yet just a few minutes later, the host lowered the microphone, turned to him, and said with a faint tremble in his voice, "Sir, if there's anything you'd like to share, we are here to listen." Gaines didn't stand. He didn't walk to the polished podium. He simply lifted his head and looked straight ahead toward the front rows where powerful figures now sat upright, as if each word he might say would carry the weight of judgment. Then he spoke, not loud, not dramatic, but as if the acoustics of the room had been calibrated for a single sentence. "At this point, does anyone here still believe 'I didn't know' is a valid excuse?" That was it. Not another word. The room fell into silence, not the kind born from confusion, but the kind that comes from being caught, stripped of titles, credentials, and authority. Each person in the room suddenly faced themselves. No one applauded. No one laughed awkwardly. No one looked away. 3 seconds later, a young NYU law student stood up. She didn't speak, didn't ask permission, didn't wait for someone to move. She just stood, then another and another. Within less than a minute, more than half the room was standing, not to honor him, but to acknowledge him. The silence now was no longer emptiness. It was a wall, an invisible blockade against every attempt at justification, rationalization, or excuse. Because that question, simple, gentle, polite, was the most powerful thing the entire conference had heard. A pure word, no head honest read, Gaines criticizes judicial system. No article broke down his speech because simply there wasn't one. Just a single tweet from an attendee which spread rapidly. He asked one question. I've built my entire career dodging that question. Today I couldn't dodge it anymore. Over 60,000 shares in 3 hours. A week later, during a closed session of the Michigan Supreme Court, the internal agenda item titled Performance Review was quietly renamed The Silence That Demands an Answer. Some police departments began adding one final line to their internal incident reports. Is there something in this situation I didn't know but should have? No one mandated it. But when a veteran sergeant scratched out that line, held up the form during a meeting and said, "For the first time in my life, I wrote down the thing that's been keeping me up at night." No one in the room objected. No one clapped either. They bowed their heads. Franklin O'Gaines left the conference the same way he arrived, quietly without an escort. Only one logistics staff member asked softly as he walked out, "Sir, did you know that your question made it impossible for us to continue the program?" He didn't respond immediately. He gave a faint smile so subtle it was unclear whether it had really happened, and replied simply, "Then maybe the program had gone too far," without asking the first right question. No emergency decrees were issued that night. No slogans were plastered along highways. There was no system reform revolution on national television. Only quiet changes, subtle, nearly imperceptible, but undeniable in their beginnings. The story of Franklin O'Gaines was no longer an event. It had become something else, a slow-moving shadow slipping into hallways, classrooms, and internal memos, not demanding anything but forcing everyone to adjust their perspective. At the Monroe County Police Department, once known for its strict adherence to protocol, a new field was added to traffic stop reports. It wasn't under reasonable suspicion or evidence at the scene, but rather an opening question. How did you feel after this stop? Answering was not mandatory, but if left blank, the report would not be approved. At first, many officers pushed back. One lieutenant said bluntly during a meeting, "I'm a cop, not a poet." Yet weeks later, he was the one resubmitting his self-assessment with a scribbled line, "I didn't feel afraid, and that's exactly why I need to think again." Jefferson High School, a curious new class appeared on the schedule. The nameless question, period. No tests, no grades, no right or wrong. Teachers didn't lecture. They simply wrote one question on the board each week and let the students fill in the rest. The first week's question, if you follow the law but hurt someone, are you still wrong? An 8th grader, Jordan Ellis, raised his hand and asked, "Do you have an example?" The teacher looked around the room, then answered slowly, "A person may have the right to interrogate someone, but if the way they question them makes the other feel belittled, then is it really a right or just a habit no one has dared to question?" No one spoke. But 2 students closed their notebooks for the first time that year, not out of boredom, but because they were genuinely wondering. In San Antonio, Texas, a local radio station launched a new segment, Things I No Longer Believe. Every Monday morning, callers could share something they once believed firmly, but no longer did. No one expected it, but in the first week, over 40 calls came in. One former officer called and simply said, "I used to think that people who didn't push back were weak. Now I think maybe they just had nothing left to prove to anyone." In Minnesota, police academies added a mandatory course called Practicing Empathetic Questioning. The course didn't focus on communication techniques. Instead, instructors had cadets face each other and read aloud. If the person in front of you were your father, your sister, your son, how would you ask differently? At first, many cadets burst out laughing. By the second week, no one laughed anymore. And at a small coffee shop in Denver, the owner taped a note behind the counter. We don't ask your name to get your order right. We ask because we believe everyone deserves to be called by their name, even just once. On the wall, someone added a handwritten line, Franklin. I've never met you, but I think I understand now. Change doesn't announce itself from a podium. It arrives like a wordless melody, yet it makes everyone pause just for a beat. A system doesn't change because of orders. It changes when it looks in the mirror and doesn't recognize itself. Franklin O. Gaines never wrote a book, never posted online, never lobbied for reform. He didn't need to. The fact that he remained silent, lived with integrity, and still walked into courtrooms like any other day was enough to make others adjust how they sat, how they listened, and how they asked themselves, am I still seeing the person in front of me as a human being? In a small classroom in Northern Oregon, a student wrote this in her final assignment: justice doesn't come from someone being convicted. It comes from realizing we can hurt others even when the law doesn't forbid it. She didn't sign her name, just the initials, FOG. No one needed to ask who that was. Franklin. Gaines never spoke out. No press conferences, no talk shows, no more conferences, no photo of him smiling with a medal, no hashtag with his name, no campaign with his face printed on t-shirts. And yet no one forgets him. He was like a sound. No one heard, but everyone felt, a cut that didn't bleed, but made the entire system go in for a heart check. People no longer called him by his title. No more Judge Gaines, no more sir, just simply him, she mind. At a law school in Philadelphia, when students were asked on their final exam, describe a situation where the system could be wrong even when procedures were followed correctly. 90% of students began with one word: Gaines. At a train station in Missouri, once the site of an incident where an officer wrote up a young man for having a sarcastic attitude, a small sign now hangs outside the watch office. Starting today, we don't police emotions, we police actions. Below that, someone taped a handwritten note. I don't need to say anything else, he said, enough with his silence. Yesterday. A 9-year-old boy in Kansas, when asked by his teacher why he wore a torn old hat to class, simply replied, because the man in that video wore one like it, and everyone stayed quiet when he walked by. At a border checkpoint, a new internal guideline was introduced before requesting an intensive search. Ask the person, what would you like me to call you? Not mandatory. No penalty for skipping it. But those who ignored it often noticed their colleagues looking at them differently. Franklin doesn't need to appear, he's become a benchmark. When a sentence is handed down, people ask, would Gaines nod? When a new police video surfaces, the question is no longer who's at fault, but rather if it were him, how would this have played out? At a small school in Oregon, at the end of class, a teacher asked, if you could invite one person who's no longer famous to speak here, who would it be? A student stood up and said clearly, the quiet man. He doesn't need to say anything, just sit there. We'll figure out what to say. All but at a national conference on justice reform, after dozens of speeches that echoed like political campaign themes, an elderly professor stood and said, I have just one sentence. If the story about him still needs to be retold, then we haven't changed enough for it to no longer need to be. The hall fell silent. The media has moved on new trends flashed by like waves across a glass screen. But his name, without scandals, without awards, keeps surfacing quietly in the pause before someone says, I have the right to. At a roadside cafe in Carolina, the owner posted a sign by the register, don't ask me who the regulars are. Ask me who made me change how I treat every person who walks in. Below that, printed in small type, a story doesn't need to be retold if it's strong enough to live on in how we treat others. Franklin. Gaines doesn't need to be credited, but he will never be forgotten. Not because he started a movement, not because he caused a scandal, but because he did nothing, and that was enough to make everyone else start doing something different. Chum. You've just read a quiet story, one that made an entire society go silent at the moment it mattered most. Leave a comment below. Have you ever witnessed something like this? What would you do if you were Rick or Franklin? And if you believe the world needs more stories like this, subscribe, because some truths don't need to be shouted, they just need to be heard at the right time.